I've been thinking about Star Wars a lot recently because on 22nd of May, The Mandalorian and Grogu hit cinemas, the first Star Wars film in 6 years. I want it to be great, I genuinely do, but I also can't shake the feeling, one I suspect a lot of you share, that we've been waiting for Star Wars to feel like it used to for a very long time now, and it keeps not quite getting there. So today I want to talk about why. Not to pile on and not to repeat the same tired Disney ruined Star Wars argument that's been done to death, but to actually try and understand what is it that made the original trilogy so extraordinary, why it's been so difficult to replicate, and whether there's any hope left. Let's start with something that sounds obvious but is actually easy to underestimate. The original Star Wars was genuinely technically revolutionary, not just a fun film revolutionary, but it changed cinema kind of revolutionary. In 1977, the dominant Hollywood output was dark, character driven, morally ambiguous work like Chinatown, Taxi Driver, and Dog Day Afternoon. America was coming out of Vietnam, Watergate, and the disillusionment of the late 60s, and cinema reflected that. Then Star Wars arrived and offered something that felt almost naive by comparison: adventure, hope, a hero's journey with clear stakes, mythological resonance, and a villain in a cape who is just unambiguously evil. George Lucas borrowed from Joseph Campbell's hero's journey, from Akira Kurosawa's samurai films, from Flash Gordon, from World War II dogfight footage. He assembled a new kind of myth from old parts, and it landed in the exact same cultural moment when people were desperate to believe in something again. And then there's the craft. Lucas asked his production designers to make everything look used, dirty, and aged. The used future look, a concept that almost nobody had applied to science fiction before. Every ship had rust on it, every droid had scuff marks, and it felt real in a way that previous sci-fi films simply hadn't. Industrial Light and Magic, the effects company Lucas founded specifically to make Star Wars, invented techniques that had just never existed before. Practical models, motion control cameras, a sound design that created an entirely new sonic language for cinema. The sounds of a lightsaber, of a TIE fighter screaming through space, of Darth Vader's breathing, none of those existed before 1977. And then there's John Williams, who built a score so emotionally direct, so perfectly calibrated to every scene of the film, that became inseparable from the experience of the film itself. The point here is that the original Star Wars wasn't just a good story, well told, it was a convergence of the right story, the right cultural moment, the right technical innovation, the right music, the right performances, that would almost certainly never happen again in the exact same way. And that's not a criticism of what came after, it's just a fact. You can't manufacture that convergence. So when Disney acquired Lucasfilm in 2012 for $4 billion, the pressure to deliver something enormous was, to put it mildly, significant. And The Force Awakens, which came out in 2015, sort of delivered on that promise, from a financial standpoint anyway. It made over $2 billion worldwide, and it had the energy and pace and charisma of previous films. Some found Daisy Ridley and John Boyega as genuinely compelling new presences, and Adam Driver was and remains one of the most interesting things to happen to Star Wars since the original trilogy. But here's the problem with The Force Awakens that you start to feel more acutely on repeat viewings. J.J. Abrams essentially made A New Hope again, not as homage, but as a template. There's a desert planet with an orphan who doesn't know their destiny. There's a droid carrying vital information. There's a superweapon that destroys planets. There's a cantina scene. There's a trench run. It's not subtle, and at the time, a lot of us, myself included, let it slide because it was fun and it felt like Star Wars again after a long absence. But the nostalgia was the product, not the story. More critically, Abrams seeded dozens of mysteries that he apparently had no intention of answering. Who is Snoke? Who are the Knights of Ren? How did the First Order rise? Why is Rey so powerful? These weren't setups for a planned story, they were what Abrams himself called mystery boxes. Questions posed for the thrill of the question, not because anyone had worked out the answer. And that structural dishonesty poisoned the entire trilogy before it had even begun. And here's the thing that looking back seems almost unbelievable. Disney bought one of the most valuable intellectual properties in entertainment history for $4 billion, announced a new trilogy, and then they didn't appoint anyone to oversee the whole story. No showrunner, no Kevin Feige equivalent sitting at the top making sure each film built coherently on the last. Abrams planted seeds. Ryan Johnson, given complete creative control for The Last Jedi, looked at those seeds and effectively decided not to water them. Snoke is killed with no explanation. Rey's parentage is revealed as nobody. A bold creative swing, but one that directly contradicted what The Force Awakens had spent 2 hours implying. Luke Skywalker, cinema's most iconic hero, is a disillusioned recluse who tries to murder his nephew in his sleep. I think The Last Jedi has more genuine filmmaking ambition than any other Disney-era Star Wars film. Ryan Johnson was actually trying something new. But trying something new in the second film of a planned trilogy, without coordinating the first or third, is not bold filmmaking. It's chaos with a good cinematographer. Then Abrams came back for The Rise of Skywalker and spent most of it undoing what Johnson had done. Palpatine returns, with no foreshadowing, no setup, no logic.
And it confirms the worst. Somehow Palpatine returned.
That line, delivered as though it explains anything, has become a shorthand for everything that went wrong. Rey is now Palpatine's granddaughter, which directly contradicts the emotional core of the previous film. The downfall of Star Wars rests with producers at Disney who somehow convinced themselves that a blockbuster trilogy didn't need the presence of any kind of overarching narrative architect to ensure at least a modicum of tonal or philosophical consistency. You can tell that they thought doing another Star Wars trilogy would be a no-brainer success, but they did it with a supremely corporate, unearned sense of confidence that IP and branding mattered far more than a carefully planned story. And then there's the volume problem. Between 2015 and 2019, Disney released 5 Star Wars films. The original trilogy came out one film every 3 years, each one an event, an occasion, something you planned around. While Star Wars films were once seen as cinematic events, it seems that the more movies are made, the less interest audiences have in seeing them. Solo is the clearest example of this. Released just 5 months after The Last Jedi, it made 393 million on a £250 million production budget before marketing costs. The franchise's first genuine box office failure. And it wasn't even a bad film, it was a perfectly competent, entertaining adventure that in any other context would have been considered a solid hit, but it arrived at the wrong moment, carrying the weight of a fandom that was exhausted and divided, and it collapsed. Then came Disney Plus. The Mandalorian was genuinely excellent, season 1 especially. It reminded people what Star Wars could feel like when it had a clear creative vision and the restraint to let characters breathe, but Lucasfilm couldn't leave it alone. The Book of Boba Fett arrived and muddied the waters. Obi-Wan Kenobi had moments of genuine emotion buried under some of the weakest direction in the franchise's history. The Acolyte was cancelled after just a single season. The sheer relentlessness of it, always something new, always something demanding your attention, made it harder and harder to care deeply about any of it. There's a real irony here. The thing that made Star Wars feel like a galaxy was its scarcity. 3 films in 6 years, then nothing for 16. That absence made the return of each new film feel genuinely momentous. Disney's strategy essentially inverted that logic, flood the market, keep people subscribed, and in doing so made Star Wars feel like less an event and more like content. But here's what I think sits underneath all of this. The original Star Wars was made by someone with something to say. George Lucas had a specific vision, messy, contradictory, sometimes self-indulgent, but genuinely his. He wanted to make a film that reconnected modern audiences with myth, with the idea that ordinary people could do extraordinary things, with the Force as a metaphor for something real, intuition, spiritual awareness, the energy that connects living things. That's not a franchise brief, that's not an IP strategy, that's a person trying to tell the world something. The Disney era films feel like they were made by people trying to figure out what the audience wanted to see, rather than the people trying to tell the audience something they didn't know yet. The Force Awakens wanted to give you the feeling of the original. The Last Jedi wanted to subvert your expectations of Star Wars. The Rise of Skywalker wanted to undo everything that upset you about The Last Jedi. Even the best Disney era content like Andor, which is genuinely one of the best things to carry the Star Wars name in decades, works precisely because Tony Gilroy didn't ask, what do Star Wars fans want? He asked, what would this story be if it were told seriously as a political thriller from the ground up? That instinct, start with the story, not the brand, is what Lucas had in 1977, and it's what the franchise has been chasing, mostly unsuccessfully, ever since. So, The Mandalorian and Grogu. I hope it's great, and I mean that. I had a lot of problems with the most recent season, from the strange side quest episodes to the Jack Black Lizzo debacle, but in its greatest moments, the relationship between Mando and Grogu is one of the best and most genuinely emotionally resonant things Star Wars has produced since the original trilogy. Simple, wordless, built on action rather than exposition. If the film has the confidence to trust that relationship and not bury it under franchise obligation, it could be something special. But I think the bigger question is what happens after, because the problem Star Wars faces right now is deeper than any single film can fix. It's a question of trust. The sequel trilogy may have actively damaged the audience's willingness to invest emotionally in a new Star Wars story, and that damage takes time to repair. You can't fix it with a bigger budget or a more beloved character or a better marketing campaign. You fix it by making genuinely great films, consistently over a long period, until people believe, again, that caring about Star Wars is worth the risk. The original trilogy earned that trust over 6 years, and 3 films that built on each other. Disney spent 12 years dismantling it. The magic isn't gone, Andor proved that, and The Mandalorian proved that. The magic is real when it's available, but it requires the thing that Disney era has most consistently failed to provide: patience, vision, and someone willing to say, this is the story we're telling, and we know how it ends.